Namo Buddhaya and welcome to Buddha Dharma TV's Saturday program. I am Lisa Chu. Today we will start with a Dharma talk, a song, followed by a Jataka tale. The Dharma talk today is by Venerable Miao Huang, who is the personal English interpreter of Venerable Master Xing Yun. She also serves as the English secretary at Fu Guangshan Founding Master's Office. She graduated with a bachelor degree from the Department of Asian Studies, University of New South Wales, and went on to complete her master in Buddhist studies at Fu Guang University. She is currently serving at Fu Guangshan Institute of Humanistic Buddhism as both a deputy chancellor and director of the Department of International Affairs. She is also the director of Fu Guang Dictionary of Buddhism English Translation Project and also the complete works of Venerable Master Xing Yin Translation Project. Honorary Fellow of Humanistic Buddhism, Nantian Institute, Adjunct Associate Professor, Department of Religious Studies, Nanhua University, and Adjunct Assistant Professor, Department of Buddhist Studies, Guangming College. We are grateful to the Venerable for sharing with us the Dharma titled Journey to Self-Discovery, Part 1.
Yes, right? The amazing discovery by the prince in India to realize that all of us has that potential, that amazing potential to really find our true self. And so I want to begin by talking about this journey that was embarked on by a human being who also shared his personal experiences with us. And I'm not sure how many have since then attained Buddhahood, but the only thing I'm sure of is that at least we are on that similar path. Okay? But as we talk about that path, many of us come across the idea of the Buddha or Buddhism through various different ways. Okay, for myself, when I was born in Taiwan, I pretty much encountered Buddhism as a heavily religious idea, where you paid a lot of homage, you did a lot of praying, all for the hope that the Buddha will bless you. So I was told by my mom to always pay respect to the Buddha so I could become a smarter student. Yeah, I could marry into a good life, and that I will die a good death, right? That was a lot of fun, especially when I was being told of that truth at 8, when my grandmother says, keep chanting Buddha's name so you will be reborn in Pure Land when you die, right? I had this whole question. I turned to my grandmother and I asked her, Grandma, I'm only 8, right? Why are you teaching me how to die now? Yeah. Sure, teach me how to die well. I will appreciate that. But can you please first teach me how to live? Right? And then my grandmother looked at me and then turned away and continued to chant Omitofo, Omitofo, Omitofo. Yeah. I could understand it because she was 75. Yeah, but for me, I wanted to really find out more about what this whole idea of Buddhism has to offer. Yeah, so really, there's that question, where did the whole idea of Buddhism come about in the beginning? Okay. It wasn't the Buddha who, upon attaining enlightenment, turned to the heavenly beings or the 5 bhikshus and say, hey, I have awakened to this whole idea of Buddhism, so I'm here to teach you Buddhism. Right? He never said that. Instead, when he was asked, you claim to become awakened and enlightened, so what exactly are you? Are you a god? He said no. Right? Are you a creator? He said no. Right? Are you a ruler of the world now that you claim to be the Buddha? Right? All along the Buddha said no. And so they asked him, you keep saying no to our queries about who you are as a Buddha. So who exactly are you? What exactly are you? The Buddha quietly turned to these heavenly beings and said, I am simply awake. Right? Awakened to the reality that we are living. A reality sometimes we don't really see face to face, eye to eye. A reality that sometimes is not as real as we want it to be. But nevertheless, that's what I have become awakened to. And so to be honest, the whole idea of Buddhism did not arise until the 19th century, when this Portuguese expedition went to the Dunhuang caves in China and discovered this whole lot of Buddhist images and scrolls and said, wow, they must be of extreme value as Oriental objects. So this person by the name of Orlstein paid a Taoist monk a very low amount of money and brought home all the treasures back to the UK. Right? So up to date, the Chinese regard him as the stealer of the treasures. But today, when we look at what he has managed to preserve, we would say he was the one who preserved the amazing teachings that were found in the Dunhuang caves. But most importantly, as he read through these scripts, he said, this is an amazing discovery by a man, right? What this man had discovered was the theory or this whole idea of awakening, right? So since he claims to be Buddha, right, he who has awakened, right? The whole root word of Bud means to awake. So if it represents an amazing teaching, why don't we just refer to this doctrine and teaching as Buddhism, right? The concept of awakening, right? The concept of awakening as a term for Buddhism or a religion of Eastern and Central Asia based on the teachings of Gautama Siddhartha. Okay. But as it passed into China, we begin to refer to it as Fojiao, right? A type of religion, a religion of the Buddha, right? A practice of the Buddha's teachings. And so this poses two very different kinds of understanding in myself. Having been raised in Australia, but based on a very Chinese Buddhist background, we are constantly being asked to weigh out the religious side and the everyday life side of Buddhism or Fojiao that we are facing. Okay? And all along, it's been a fun journey because being in Australia, it gave me much more chances to really rediscover my own definition, instead of simply inheriting the tradition that has been given to us by our predecessors. And so I appreciate this teaching by George Bernard Shaw. When he says, life isn't about finding yourself, he first denies the conventional opening statement about why you would be a Buddhist. Right? People will ask, why did you become a Buddhist? To find myself. George Bernard Shaw would have said, no, right? You have always been there. You never lost yourself, so you don't need to don't need to find yourself. But he says, no, it's not about finding yourself. Life's about creating yourself. Right? What kind of value do you give to yourself? What kind of face do you give to that self? And so that too reflected quite well with Siddhartha's comment. Do not take other words for granted. Do not take for granted what others tell you about what I teach. Take it into your own hands, put it into test, trial it, doubt it, prove it before you claim it to be yours. I believe that would be our process of self-reinvention and creation. Okay. And so having said that, as I come along basic upbringing in Taiwan, and then having received my education in Australia, and then in the previous 20 years, really having had that opportunity to see what Buddhism has become across the world, these are the types of Buddhism that I see. Okay? First of all, in the East, just as my grandmother had told me, right, learning is about how to transcend life and death. Right? I appreciate that. But it's just that it turned from this type of religion, right? Transcending life is about offering as much incenses as possible. The bigger, the better, right? Right. So you have to make sure your incense is in the center so the Buddha will reply and respond to your prayer. Yeah. But as Buddhism continues to reinvent itself in an Australian setting, we discovered that it's taken in something a little bit more different now. What we see is Buddhism in the West gives us a challenge on how we understand reality based on the teachings. Right? I'm not sure if you chanted the Heart Sutra today. The Heart Sutra is really about a journey of understanding reality. Okay? So how do we understand reality? When Buddhism passed to the West, it was the our religious teachers, the scientists, and the philosophers who began thinking about this mystical Oriental faith. And so when Bishop George Berkeley came across this very interesting Eastern teaching on psychology, right, he started to explore the concepts of Buddhism by asking this question. If a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? So I would like to ask you that question. Does it? Yes. Okay. So what about those who think no? Okay, we have 1, 2. Yeah. Okay, for many reasons, right? And so this is how George Berkeley explained his answer. His answer was no. Why? Because sound is the vibration of air that is caught by the organisms in your ears. If your ears are not there to catch the vibration of the air, then there is no sound. Right? This is a Western exploration of reality from a Buddhist perspective. If you think it's there, it's really not there. Because when I asked that question, you probably imagine the sound of a tree falling in a forest. But even if you imagine that bang, right, it doesn't make a sound. So that's how the exploration began in the West. But now as we come into what we call a modern day world where we live as global citizens, right? Many of us have been raised as polyglots who grow up in at least 4 countries. We discover that Buddhism has gone from the transcendence of life and death to the understanding of reality, now into a way of life. Right? We are hoping that the Dharma could offer a guidance as to how we live better before we die better. Right? Both are important, I would have to say. Okay? And therefore, now we look at Buddhism in this phase. Right? We share it among our families. Right? We pass on our values. But most importantly, we leave an open path for our future generation to explore. So they are the ones to decide if you should choose the path which Siddhartha did, how would you travel it? And I hope you travel it well. Right? That is the modern day. Okay? So as I think about the evolvement of Buddhism under my own personal experiences, right, I can't help but wonder, so in this way, what kind of Buddhist teachings offers us a guidance or a path to really finding that betterment of life and death? Okay? And then I was handed a very, very simple scroll of sutra, something which probably has been your first encounter at Zhongtian. Right? When you come and join the chanting, they will say, hey, take this one. This is the easy one. It's nice and short, right? It's the core of the Dharma, chanted, right? And then you could be closer to that path. Okay. Which is that sutra? Yes, the Heart Sutra. Right? As we talk about the Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra, right? It really talks about the heart of Buddha's teachings. Right? Thousands and thousands of scrolls condensed into 260 characters. Okay. But what it is about? Is it about your heart? No, right? The heart is the descriptive word for the core of the Buddha's teachings. And therefore, if it's not about the heart, what you need to understand is at the same time, when you chant this, what you understand hopefully will be an understanding or a perception that is derived from your heart that also continues to evolve. Because you are a different person every day, right? If today you gaze upon the Buddha or the Bodhisattva and feel a moment of compassion, you share that kindness with the people around you, your heart becomes that of the Buddha or the Bodhisattva. But if today you turn around and scream at somebody out of anger, right? You're no longer with the heart of the Buddha. What kind of heart do you have? Still your heart, right? You just allowed it to change. So how are you able to go from a heavenly state to what we call a really terrible state just in a moment? But it all comes from the heart. The answers could be found from the Heart Sutra. Okay, so what I would like to do is maybe in the next hour or two, talk a little bit about how I have come to understand the Heart Sutra. Okay. So as you continue to chant all of this, have you ever wondered what exactly is it talking about? Can anybody in one short sentence tell me your understanding of the Heart Sutra? Right. I look at you, you try to turn away, right? And I look at many of you who have really repeated these, concise ancient Buddhist sutra maybe for thousands of times. Yeah. But what is the reason why we never actually sought to understand what it is telling us? Okay. If that's the truth, then the next hour hopefully should be something of reference to you. Okay. So this is how I understand it. Okay. Although it begins with Avalokiteshvara, right? There's actually a longer version of the Heart Sutra. It begins with the Buddha meditating. He was entering deep, deep meditative samadhi. And then suddenly, two of his disciples who were also practicing are inspired to speak up. Okay. So this is a pretty common setting of an opening in a dialogue between the Buddha and his disciples, except this time the Buddha chose not to talk through his own voice. He chose to talk through two of his best teachers, best students. So suddenly in that deep meditative concentration, his most wise student named Sariputra, the foremost in wisdom, suddenly spoke up, right? Because somebody has to open up a question for a discussion on the Dharma to happen. So suddenly Sariputra turns to Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara and asked, "Oh, great one, I heard that you are so well practiced in your perfection of wisdom, right? The Prajna Paramita. Can you tell me how a good man and a good woman should practice accordingly in order to attain that perfection of wisdom?" Right? Imagine when you receive that question. Right? And so the Bodhisattva goes into that very elegant recline, right? The wonderful Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, and begins to answer that question. Okay? So what we see in this case is the fact that the Heart Sutra is really about a sharing by Avalokiteshvara on how he had attained the perfection of wisdom. Right? And he does it in such an elegant way. Okay? And we would say it's a recall or a backflash of an enlightened one on his journey to enlightenment, on his journey to self-discovery. Okay? So the Heart Sutra opens by saying, when Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva was causing in a deep Prajna Paramita, he realized, first of all, that the 5 skandhas are empty in nature, and thus he overcame all ills and suffering. Right? So it's a very familiar opening to all of us, correct? We hear, read, and see this all the time. Okay? But what does this line mean? Okay? And we would say, as Avalokiteshvara sits in that very elegant recline, he decides to give us a recap on his journey to self-discovery on 3 levels. And when he says the 5 skandhas are empty in nature, he is presenting to us the first level of self-discovery. That is, emptiness on its most simple level. Okay? So if you have attended the classes on Buddhism, you might understand that the 5 skandhas are what? Form, perception, volition, mental formation, and consciousness. Okay? So we pretty much kind of just skip by that and move on to the next line. Okay, so what exactly does it mean? And so the Bodhisattva tells us, okay, in order to understand the perfection of wisdom, you first have to come to reality with yourself. What is that true self? Right? And is this the you sitting here that your true self? Yes or no? Okay, if you said no, then who is sitting here? Yeah. Is it your body? Right? What is it? So actually, and the answer is yes. The you sitting here are as real as you can be, right? To be real is your first step to understanding reality. Okay? But he goes on to say that the first thing you recognize is how real you are, but at the same time, how fast that real you actually change. Okay? So there are a lot of misconceptions about emptiness, which tells us that you are not here. Right? I once hopped on a taxi in Taipei, and on the way, this taxi driver just kept turning over to look at me, fidgeting, right, trying to hold back his question. So finally I asked him, "You have a question for me, right?" And so he was very surprised. He was like, "Oh, how do you know?" Yeah. Because I can see you turning around looking at me very, out of curiosity. Right? It's as simple as that. Yeah. And so I said, okay, if you have any questions, just ask. That's fine. And so he asked me, Venerable, right? You Buddhists always talk about emptiness, right? That this real you is not here, right? So if you don't exist, right, can I treat you as empty? Okay. Right? He's right? That's how we explain emptiness. So in reply, I asked him, Sir, as we arrive at the destination, right, if you treat me as emptiness, as someone who doesn't exist, I'm going to walk away without paying you. Yeah. Yeah. Then he goes, no, you have to pay. That doesn't work, right? There you go. I told him, right? If you treat me as real as a human being, then I will pay you. Because that's the way natural reality actually works, right? Because I'm as real as I can be. But the only thing that is empty is of a constant, never-changing nature. So by saying that empty, right, it means that it's a characteristic that we have, right? It's not a set nature. We are actually empty in our ability to never change. Would you agree? Yeah. So a few moments ago, Venerable Jue San was in a meeting, right? So at that moment, she was a construction director. Yeah. And then 10 minutes ago, she was on stage introducing me. She was the coordinator. Right? And now she has very kindly and compassionately joined you in the audience as a listener. So which one is the real Venerable Jue San? Right? All of them. Yeah. So that emptiness of the self can be thus concluded as a self that has enough flexibility to be anything and nothing. Right? Playing the right role at the same time, at the right time, in the right place, gives you the ability to remain empty in a self. So you don't insist. Because Venerable Jue San would have never told me, hey, I'm the abbess, I should sit in the middle. Right? She knows that does not work. So it's an awareness of reality of when to be what at the right time. Okay, so as we talk about the 5 skandhas, you look at it this way, right? We begin with form, right? And so by an existence of the self, we would say, yes, first of all, through your eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. We see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, right? So at this moment, if the eyes sees something, right? A conglomeration of flowers, reflection of light, reflection of air. Right? What happens is, after form or object, what we sense is we perceive something. For example, when you perceive this, right, you will think of this as a cup, right? But I haven't done anything to it. Why would you know that it's a cup? Because you have used it before. You have realized that usually people hold things in a cup. You drink out of it, right? But the funny thing is, your eyes just make contact with it. Why would you tell yourself that it's a cup? Right? Because what happens is, as you look at the form, right, you remember at the level of the formation of mental image from the previous time that you have used this thing. So what you are doing is not a simple interaction with this cup, but a mere retraction of the memory of your previous interaction with this. So you tell yourself, this is a cup. You go out into the garden, you see this is a flower. Okay. But now we have virtual reality that could just pop up a 3D flower in front of you, and then you will still tell yourself that this is a flower. Right? So at that moment, what happened to yourself is that you allowed your vision, your hearing, your senses to decide what you're feeling. Okay? And so by saying that the 5 skandhas are empty, it's merely telling you that don't trust what you see. What you see is not what you see. Okay? You need a bit more time to interact with it and to make sure that every time you experience it, it's going to be something different. So allow yourself to have each unique experiences before you decide on what your reality is. Okay, say for example, what do you see here? Ice cream, right? It's a smooth, yellow, glittering, sweetening scoop in front of you. Okay? So that's exactly what my friend did when she went to a 5-star hotel restaurant, saw that round scoop sitting on the table in a restaurant. She immediately picked it up, put it into her mouth by thinking, ice cream. And then what happened was, ew, it's actually margarine. Yeah. So I want to recap. What happened here? That self, thinking that what you're seeing is really ice cream, has deceived yourself by telling your mind that based on my previous experience of ice cream that is round, right? It's tasty, it's heaven sent, right? Anytime in the future you see the same image again, you taste the same thing again, it's going to be ice cream. Okay? And so if we recap, what happens is, at that moment, we take out from our memories our experiences of the ice cream, right? And going back to that mental formation, the concept of ice cream thereby arises. Just as I mentioned the concept of coffee right now, right? You suddenly can taste the fragrance of coffee, right? Suddenly you're awake. Yeah. Suddenly you're joyful, right? And so you talk your mind into having really received the concept of coffee, but at the same time, you haven't really drunken a single drop. And so that's what we mean by mental formation. You tend to talk yourself into the reality you're seeing. And so once again, you go back to your sensations, right? Your eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body to experience the reality again before you decide. Okay, so I would ask you to please be careful when somebody hands you a cup and calls it coffee. Take a good look. Smell it. Yeah, confirm before you do. Okay. So this is my understanding of when the Bodhisattva says he saw that the 5 skandhas are empty, thus he overcame all ills and suffering. Right? So by understanding that our experiences are constantly changing, we won't be fooled into our own expectations. Because most of the time when we give rise to expectations based on our experiences and perceptions, most of the time we become disappointed. And that's where the ills and suffering arise. Okay? Again, we refer to the ills and suffering as dukkha. Right? Suffering is a state of mind or a feeling when you're mentally and physically unwell. But sometimes I have a problem with this translation. Because by dukkha, it literally means when the wheel of a cart falls out of its pivot. So you might imagine when a cart gets pulled along by an ox, but the wheel is not well fixed into its socket, right? That cart is not going to move forward smoothly. It's going to struggle, it will break down. So you might imagine the sense of dukkha when we align it to our expectations of reality, and when reality fails to be, we are going to suffer because something doesn't fit. Something doesn't seem to fit quite well. Okay. And therefore, I would like to say a quick conclusion of what the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara means by the 5 skandhas being empty. First of all, yes, you are you. Right? You are as real as you. And you, in fact, are what you see. Your eye, ear, nose, tongue, body all exist. Okay? But the most important thing is when we move on to the fact that the 5 skandhas are empty, it really depends on how you react to the things that are happening. Right? How do we align our thoughts to reality? And thirdly, you are you because you experience each incident differently, and that creates you. But please remember, the next time it happens, it's going to be very different. Okay? And so the realization of emptiness on a self level is only an awakening for us to think about how fast the self changes. Okay? The self you think is you is always changing, so give yourself a few more moments to experience what's coming in front of you. And secondly, there are many of such selves that arise all the time, because every day, every moment, you confront reality with a rather different self. Right? A happy self, a joyful self, a doubtful self. And then the most important thing is when the Bodhisattva says, hey, this is empty, wake up to it and think about how fast that will change. And so, in conclusion, don't cling onto any of them as the real you while you make peace with each individual experience. Okay. Therefore, the 5 skandhas are empty. Okay. And so I want to use an example about myself. Right? As we talk about the five skandhas are empty, we might discover that in most cases we tend to scare ourselves before anything happens. So a few years ago, I was in Beijing, and then our building in Beijing was a rectangular one that had a very long corridor. So on the morning that I arrived, they settled me into my room. So before I entered my room, I heard this little girl running around screaming, and she was wearing a skirt, and she was about 1 meter tall. I took a quick glance of her, and then I moved on to my class in Beijing. And so that was a long day. By the time I finished my class, it was already 11 p.m. So as I had made my way back to my room, I realized I had turned off the lights on in the corridor. So it was a long, dark corridor except for the green egress light at the end. Right? Familiar feeling? Yeah. So I told myself not to think about anything, just walk along, reach my room. But all along, I could feel something behind me standing at the edge of the corridor, right? Playing around with her skirt and staring at me. Yeah. So that was 11 p.m., and then I wondered why a little girl would be away from her parents and standing at the end of a long, dark corridor, right? And that started to feel quite spooky, right? Because obviously that would not be a normal little girl, right? What kind of little girl appears at 11 p.m. in the dark? Yeah. Not ghost, your mind, right? The kind of girl you create in your mind. And then I asked myself, hey, as a monastic, I'm not supposed to be scared, right? So why am I all spooked now by that little girl at the end of the corridor? Hey, turn my mind back onto the Buddha. So I kept walking back to my room. Then for the rest of that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what that little girl was doing. Okay. And then the morning came, I stepped out of my room, and sunlight actually spilled through the window. So as I looked down the end of the corridor, I burst into laughter. What I had been thinking was a little girl all along was just a huge tree plant placed next to the window beneath the air conditioning. So that's why it was swaying, right? Yeah. And so all along I have been scared by my own Atman, my own personal perceptions, right? Something that wasn't real but had been made very, really real. And that's where my dukkha comes from. And so we might imagine the process of meditation, if we had that chance to really think about where our emotions and perceptions comes from, we will have more time to really digest it. So I would say on that very first level, yes, you are true, you are real, but you're always changing. So embrace that ever-changing self. Okay. And by that ever-changing self, I would say we can move on to that second line. Right? Having explained that the five skandhas are empty, Avalokiteshvara then turns on to Sariputra and say, remember the next thing, right? Form is emptiness, and the emptiness is form, right? So now we're talking about emptiness as a type of nature, right? A nature in all living beings. And while when we talk about form, it's a phenomena, right? So if you're looking at ourselves as a person, how does our nature different from our form? Okay. You would say in nature I'm a compassionate person, right? But by appearance I look angry, right? Remember back in our school days, right? Whenever we walked into the library, the grumpy looking librarian, it would be the face that greets you, that kind of scares you a little bit. Yeah. But once you start to look for books, she smiles and then she turns into heaven, right? And so we would say by this, here's a question of the difference between water, wind, and wave. Right? So in nature, water made of H2O is just water. But added to the movement applied by gravity and wind, somehow water gets sprayed into air and becomes what we see as wave. Right? But the moment it falls back into the water, it becomes water again. Therefore, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Okay. We are simply the same in nature, but we choose to react very, very differently when different situations arise. Okay. But whatever it is, we have to remember that it is deep within our heart that we can find our true, calm, and compassionate self. It's not just what you think, but rather, in the end, what do you come to be? So there was a lady who was about to go on a holiday. She checked herself in at the airport, and she had about an hour before boarding time. But since it was traveling season, the lounge was very packed. So she had no choice but to share a table with a man. Okay? And that ruined her mood a little bit because she thought to herself, hey, I'm about to go on a holiday, right? So I want to relax. But now I have to share a table with a man at a very crowded lounge. What should I do? Okay, she told herself, okay, relax. Remember, I'm enjoying my holiday, right? So what would make myself enjoy my time? She took out her book, her favorite book, and her favorite bag of chocolate chip cookie, right? I'm going to read something I enjoy. I'm going to eat these heavenly drops of crunchy, juicy chocolate chip cookie. That's how I ask myself to enjoy myself. So she sits down, reads through a few pages in the book, right? And then she reaches out to the bag of chocolate cookies on the table. She takes one to eat it. But funny thing happened. The man sitting across from her looked up, smiled at her, and without saying a word, also helped himself to a chocolate cookie. Yeah. This was strange. She started to feel extremely uncomfortable. Right? How rude of you to not even ask for permission to eat out of my bag of chocolate cookie. Okay. Then she reminded herself again, I'm on holidays, right? I have to get myself back to that good mood. It's okay. I have a big heart enough, a heart big enough to share one chocolate chip cookie. So she went back to her book. She read through a few more pages. She reached out for a second chocolate chip cookie. Funny thing happened. The man also smiled again, quietly helped himself to a second chocolate chip cookie. Okay. So this moment, up until now, she becomes a little bit agitated, right? So at that moment, she could no longer focus on her book. All she could think about is, how unfortunate am I to have come across a rude man on my beautiful holiday's beginning, right? So she forced a smile and pretended to be reading the book, right? All along trying to suppress her anger. So for the rest of the waiting time, every time she reached out for a chocolate cookie, the man across from her would also do the same, right? Until there came the last piece of chocolate cookie sitting in the bag. Yeah, so the lady looked at the man with a smile thinking, I'm going to see if you're going to be polite enough to let me have my last piece of chocolate cookie. Okay. Then the man also smiled back, quietly reached for that chocolate chip cookie, broke it in half and shared half with her. Yeah. And so at that moment, she could no longer contain her anger. Right? She was about to scream at the man for being so rude. Right? But luckily, the call for boarding came, so she packed herself up and rushed on board, right? With a very angry heart. Right? All along thinking, oh, how unlucky of me to come across a terrible man at the beginning of my journey. But when she finally settled herself down on her seat, she told herself, okay, I'm on my way to Bali, right, to a beautiful beach. I'm going to relax and not to be angry. Right? So she took a deep breather, reached for her bag for her book and said, okay, I'm going to keep reading my book. And then what she saw underneath her book in the bag is a totally new bag of unopened chocolate chip cookies. Yeah. So all along, she has been eating out of the man's bag, who smiled every single time, remained polite, didn't scream at her or frown at her, and was so generous to even share the last piece with her. Right? And so as we say, form is no different from emptiness. Right? It means that it's no different from what we look on the surface can be the same as our flexibility to choose the right role to play at the right time and to respond in the right way at the right time. Therefore, your anger, right, that your wind of anger once falls back into the water will still be that calm and peaceful water. Right? So therefore, the Heart Sutra tells us to only seek that true nature of flexibility and openness, that selflessness, instead of turning, dancing, and tangling with the wind and the wave, which mistakens us to be that true reality. Okay. And so as we think about how far we are from the attainment of the perfection of wisdom, right? We could meditate and meditate and meditate, feel peaceful for the 5 minutes, but as soon as you walk out, right, a little girl flies your way, sets her ice cream flying into your face, right? I guarantee you the calmness will go away very, very quickly. Yeah. And so therefore, our understanding of that emptiness really has to come in both ways.
Let us now listen to a Buddhist song titled A Light in the Darkness by Wayfarers.
I was alone in the forest, meditating. At nightfall, my only company was the flickering light from a kerosene lamp that someone gave. Though little it may be, that light gave me strength to keep on striving. It taught me to remember the kindness of others, no matter how simple or how small the acts appear to be.
It's a gift we must always remember. It's flame burns to comfort lost feeling. It's flame burns to comfort lost feeling. Darkness can be seen from afar. Burn on fire for the comfort of many. A light in the darkness can be seen from afar. By sharing with others.
Now, it is time for Jataka Tales, which is a large collection of Buddhist morality stories whereby Buddha recounts some of his past lives on his journey towards enlightenment. The Jataka tale today is the Kapi Jataka tale.
กะปิชาดกว่าด้วยการโกหกหลอกลวงภิกษุในพระพุทธศาสนานั้นแม้จะมีพระพุทธวินัยเป็นวัดปฏิบัติควบคุมอยู่อย่างดีแล้วก็ตามแต่ด้วยเหตุแห่งกรรมยังทำให้พระศาสนาต้องหมองมัวอยู่บ้างเพราะภิกษุบางรูปผิดพระวินัยพระพุทธศาสดาเมื่อประทับอยู่ณพระเชตวันมหาวิหารในพุทธกาลนั้นก็ทรงเคยปรารภถึงภิกษุผิดศีลข้อมุสาวาทผู้หนึ่งที่มาบวชอยู่ในพระศาสนาของพระองค์ภิกษุรูปนี้เป็นชาวเมืองสาวัตถีเหมือนภิกษุส่วนใหญ่ในมหาวิหารนี้เป็นสงฆ์ผู้ขาดศีลข้อโกหกหลอกลวงมาตลอดพรรษาและยังกระทำผิดพระพุทธบัญญัติข้อนี้ต่อไปโดยผู้ใดทัดทานก็ไม่ฟัง
เป็นผู้ทรงศีลแท้ๆแต่ยังมุสาโกหกคนเข้าไปทั่วช่างไม่บังควรโดยแท้
ใช่สงสัยจะท่องพระวินัยข้อมุสาวาทาไม่ถูกอย่างนี้มันน่าจับศึกซะให้รู้แล้วรู้รอดไปเลย
ทั้งยังแสวงหาประโยชน์จากเหล่าภิกษุอื่นด้วยการหลอกลวงเป็นอาจิน
นี่ท่านลาภสักการะของเราล่ะคฤหัสถ์ที่ทำบุญน่ะสั่งว่าให้มาเรียกเอาจากท่านเอามาเร็วๆสิทำเป็นหน้างงอยู่ได้
เล่นกันนิ่มๆเนียนๆอย่างนี้เลยแล้วเนี่ยไม่ไหว
หลายครั้งยังกล่าวเท็จกับอุบาสกอุบาสิกาหลอกลวงเอาทรัพย์บ้างของกินของใช้บ้างตามแต่สถานการณ์จะอำนวย
เอาเข้ามาเอาของอะไรทำบุญเหรอวันนี้
ลูกจันลูกสมอเอาไว้ฉันในฤดูหนาวเจ้าค่ะส่วนผ้าห่มยังไม่มีนะเจ้าค่ะแต่ก็คงจะได้ในเร็ววันนี้แล้วจะนำมาถวายเจ้าค่ะ
สาธุอาตมาก็ขออนุโมทนาบุญด้วยนะโยม เป็นไปตามแผน
กระทั่งใกล้ฤดูหนาวคราวหนึ่งพระภิกษุผู้มุสายังกล้าลวงให้คนวรรณะช่างมาก่อเตาผิงไฟให้ตนโดยพูดให้เข้าใจว่าทำถวายแก่พระเถระ
พระเถระหลายรูปชราภาพมากแล้วถ้าเจออากาศเย็นเข้าไปจะอาพาธได้โยมมาทำเตาผิงไฟเป็นฐานให้แบบเนี้ยกุศลแรงนะโยม
สาธุขอรับพระคุณเจ้า
การแก้หนาวด้วยการลวงอุบาสกในครั้งนี้เป็นเหตุใหญ่ภิกษุสงฆ์ทั้งหลายมาพบเห็นเข้าก็สุดจะห้ามปรามเพราะเอื่อมระอาจึงพากันเข้าเฝ้ากราบทูลต่อพระบรมศาสดาในธรรมศาลาคราหนึ่ง
เดี๋ยวเนี่ยกล้าหลอกให้ชาวบ้านมาทำเตาผิงไปให้ตัวเองถึงในวัดในวากันเลยหรือเนี่ยช่างไม่เกรงอกเกรงใจพระบรมศาสดากันบ้างเลย
เห็นทีคงต้องแจ้งแก่พระบรมศาสดาซะแล้วล่ะท่านขืนปล่อยไว้ชาวบ้านจะเดือดร้อนและพระศาสนาของพระพุทธองค์จะมัวหมองได้นะท่าน
จริงด้วยงั้นเรารีบไปกันเถอะ
สมเด็จพระผู้มีพระภาคเจ้าเมื่อสดับว่ายังมีสงฆ์สาวกผู้บวชในพระพุทธศาสนาอันมีหน้าที่นำเวนยสัตว์ให้หลุดล่อนออกจากเปลือกตมแห่งกิเลสพ้นจากกองทุกข์ทั้งหลายทั้งปวงกลับมาบำเพ็ญผิดหลอกลวงผู้อื่นอยู่อีกก็ปรารภถึงภิกษุนี้ตรัสว่าดูก่อนภิกษุทั้งหลายอันภิกษุนี้เมื่ออดีตชาติก็เคยเป็นผู้ที่โกหกหลอกลวงต่อนักบวชมาแล้วเหมือนกันเหตุเพียงเพราะต้องการไฟเท่านั้นเองแล้วสมเด็จพระพุทธศาสดาก็รำลึกอดีตชาติของภิกษุผู้นั้นด้วยปุเพนิวาสานุสติญาณตรัสเล่ากะปิชาดกขึ้นดังนี้พาราณสีนครครั้งอดีตรุ่งเรืองอยู่ริมฝั่งคงคามหานาทีปวงประชาทุกวรรณะใช้ชีวิตมีความสุขสงบเป็นอันดีในครั้งนั้นยังมีครอบครัวพราหมณ์ตระกูลหนึ่งอยู่กินกันได้ไม่นานก็ให้กำเนิดลูกน้อยเป็นทายาทสืบสกุลพราหมณ์สามีภรรยาทั้งสองต่างเลี้ยงดูลูกและใช้ชีวิตอยู่อย่างมีความสุขจนกระทั่งลูกเติบโต เป็นกุมารน้อยวัยกำลังน่ารักนางพรามณีผู้เป็นแม่และภรรยาของบ้านก็มาจากไป
แม่จ๋าแม่จากลูกไปพรหมโลกแล้วแม่จ๋า
อย่าเศร้าโศกเสียใจไปเลยลูกเอ้ยบัดนี้แม่ของเจ้าหมดกรรมในชาตินี้แล้วทำใจซะเถอะลูก
เมื่อทำพิธีปลงศพนางพรามณีนั้นความเป็นอนัตตาไม่มีสิ่งใดมีอยู่จริงทุกสิ่งที่เป็นอนิจจังก็ประจักษ์ชัดแก่ผู้ที่เฝ้ามองดูอยู่ข้างหลัง
ลูกเอ๋ยเจ้าจงดูเถิดทุกสิ่งไม่ใช่ของเราเลยจริงๆแม้เนื้อหนังมังสาของเราก็ต้องทิ้งไว้เมื่อตายลงถึงมีทรัพย์มากเมื่อวาระสุดท้ายของชีวิตมาถึงก็มิอาจเอาติดตัวไปได้เลยสักชิ้นช่างเป็นทุกข์ยิ่งนัก
หลังจากจัดการเรื่องศพของภรรยาเสร็จสิ้นแล้วพราหมณ์ผู้เป็นสามีก็ตัดสินใจมอบบ้านเรือนทรัพย์สินแก่ญาติและคนรับใช้จนหมดสิ้น
บัดนี้ข้าพเจ้าได้สละแล้วซึ่งทรัพย์สินความสะดวกสบายทั้งหลายทานอันข้าพเจ้าได้กระทำนี้จงเป็นเครื่องนำสู่ธรรมะอันสงบในเบื้องหน้าด้วยเถิด
เมื่อตัดสินใจอย่างแน่วแน่แล้วพราหมณ์ผู้เป็นพ่อจึงจูงมือลูกน้อยมุ่งหน้าสู่ป่าถือศีลบวชเป็นฤาษีโดยให้บุตรชายบวชเป็นดาบทกุมารน้อยคอยติดตามไปด้วยกัน
ตามพ่อมาเถิดลูกรักเราทั้งสองจะไปบำเพ็ญภาวนาค้นหาความสุขที่แท้จริงของชีวิตกัน
ขอรับท่านพ่อ
ฤาษีออกเสาะแสวงหาสถานที่อันสงบเป็นสัปปายดีเข้าที่หนึ่งในแนวป่าหิมพานต์จึงจัดการปลูกศาลาอาสมขึ้นหลังหนึ่งเพื่ออาศัยพักสังขารหลบแดดฝนและปฏิบัติธรรมส่วนดาบทน้อยแม้ยังเยาว์วัยนักแต่ก็รู้ประสาเฝ้าปรนนิบัติพระฤาษีคอยหาผลไม้น้ำดื่มกินมิได้อนาทรตามพละกำลังตน
ฮึบเก็บผลไม้นี่ก็เหนื่อยเหมือนกันแฮะแต่ก็สนุกดีเอากลับไปให้ท่านพ่อดีกว่า
จนวันเวลาล่วงเลยมาได้ระยะหนึ่งทุกๆวันในบริเวณใกล้อาสมฤาษีนั้นยังมีลิงเกเรตัวหนึ่งมักแวะเวียนมาคอยสังเกตสังกาดูความเป็นไปของฤาษีและดาบทน้อยอยู่เสมอแม้ขณะนักบวชพ่อลูกออกป่าเพื่อหาผลหมากรากไม้เป็นอาหารประทังชีวิตมันก็ยังพยายามเฝ้าติดตามไปแทบทุกแห่งนับวันลิงตัวนั้นก็ยิ่งเฝ้าดูฤาษีและดาบทน้อยใกล้เข้าทุกทีพระฤาษีแม้รู้ทันแต่ก็มิได้แสดงออกยังคงบำเพ็ญเพียรภาวนาอย่างสงบต่อไปและแล้ววันหนึ่งเมื่อนักบวชพ่อลูกกลับจากป่าญาณสัมผัสของพระฤาษีก็ล่วงรู้ถึงสิ่งผิดปกติในอาสมของตน
เกิดเหตุไม่ดีที่อาสมของเราแล้วล่ะดาบทน้อยเอ้ยรีบตามพ่อไปดูกันเถิด
เมื่อมาถึงก็พบว่าภายในอาสมถูกรื้อค้นทำลายข้าวของกระจุยกระจายไปหมด
ท่านพ่อดูสิเรามาอยู่ในป่าลึกกันแท้ๆยังมีโจรใจบาปมาขโมยของอีกจนได้
ช้าก่อนลูกพ่อเหตุที่เกิดนี้ไม่ใช่ฝีมือของมนุษย์หรอกหากแต่เป็นลิงตัวนั้นมากระทำตามวิสัยของมันตั้งหากล่ะอันวิสัยของลิงป่านั้นเจ้าเล่ห์เพทุบายมันทั้งดุร้ายเป็นสัตว์เดรัจฉานไม่มีความเป็นมิตรเก่งในกิริยาหลอกลวงให้หลงในอาการจนไม่อาจทายใจของพวกมันได้ถูกที่สำคัญนะมักจะกระทำชั่วชอบลักขโมยให้ผู้อื่นเดือดร้อนอยู่เสมอ
ครั้นสิ้นวสันตฤดูพิรุณหยาดสุดท้ายก็หยุดลงลมเหมันก็เริ่มเดินทางมาห่มพื้นป่าอาสมของฤาษีเองก็ไม่ได้รับการยกเว้นพระฤาษีจึงหยิบเอาหนังเสือโคร่งที่เก็บไว้ออกมาคลุมเฉวียงบ่าให้ดาบทน้อยปากก็พร่ำสอนว่า
นี่ห่มหนังเสือโคร่งแล้วก็ผิงไฟก็จะได้บรรเทาความหนาวลงได้แล้วเราก็จะได้นั่งสมาธิบำเพ็ญภาวนากันอย่างอบอุ่นนะลูก
อุ่นขึ้นจริงๆด้วยขอรับท่านพ่อ
ฤดูหนาวคราวนั้นพระฤาษีและดาบทน้อยห่อหุ้มร่างกายมิดชิดและก่อกองไฟไล่ความหนาว การดำเนินจิตบริกรรมกสิณในอาสมอย่างอบอุ่นราบรื่นมีสมาธิตามปกติต่อเมื่อครั้งมีเสียงดังที่หน้าประตูอาสมดาบทน้อยซึ่งยังเข้าสมาธิไม่นิ่งสนิทก็มองดูออกไป
ฮะมีฤาษีมายืนหนาวสั่นอยู่ขอเชิญท่านเข้ามาหลบหนาวในบรรณศาลานี้เถิด
ดาบทน้อยเอื้อมมือเปิดประตูให้แขกผู้มาขอพักหนาวทันใดนั้นเองพระฤาษีผู้เป็นบิดาก็คว้าคบไฟชิงก้าวตัดหน้าออกไปก่อน
ช้าก่อนดาบทน้อยของพ่ออาคันตุกะตัวนี้ไม่ใช่ฤาษีที่ไหนหรอกลูกหากแต่เป็นผู้หลอกลวงเราด้วยเอาหนังเสือและชดาจากซากศพฤาษีที่ตายแล้วมาห่มหวังพักผิงไฟแก้หนาวก็เท่านั้น
เมื่อเจอคบไฟวูบวาบฤาษีปลอมก็กระโดดหนีตามสัญชาตญาณลิงแต่เดิมเมื่อหลบหนีจนพ้นเปลวไฟแล้วลิงนักหลอกลวงแยกเขี้ยวยิงฟันคู่ยังไม่พอใจแล้วก็หลบหนีไปจนไกลและไม่กล้ากลับมารบกวนสองนักบวชพ่อลูกอีกเลยเมื่อตรัสเล่ากปิชาดกจบแล้วสมเด็จพระผู้มีพระภาคเจ้าจึงประชุมชาดกในพุทธกาลนั้นว่าลิงเกเรกำเนิดเป็นภิกษุผู้โกหกหลอกลวงดาบทน้อยกำเนิดเป็นพระราหุลพระฤาษีเสวยพระชาติเป็นสมเด็จพระสัมมาสัมพุทธเจ้า
It's a gift we must always remember. It's flame burns to comfort lost feeling. It's flame burns to comfort lost feeling. Darkness can be seen from afar. Burn on fire for the comfort of many. A light in the darkness can be seen from afar. By sharing with others.
That concludes today's program. If you have any questions about the contents of our broadcast, please feel free to reach out to us at info@bdtv.com. Our dedicated team remains committed for sharing the profound teachings of the Buddha, helping you walk the path of wisdom and enlightenment. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow at the same time. Namo Buddhaya.